It begins in a hush, so deep it feels older than time itself, as if the air had been waiting centuries just to hold this one fragile sound, the cry of a newborn beneath a sky split by two pale moons. The light that fell upon him was not warm, nor was it cold, but something in between, as though the universe had yet to decide what kind of story it wished to give him. Those who stood nearby whispered softly, almost reverently, for even in his first breaths there was a stillness that unsettled them. They did not know why, but they felt the child was listening in a way no child should, as though the whole of creation had leaned close to speak, and he, impossibly, had understood. He was small, like any child, but his eyes carried a curious weight, reflecting the silvery glow of the moons as if they were secrets placed inside him. People turned away quickly when he looked at them, not out of fear, but from a discomfort they could not name. And yet, in the lull between whispers, someone hummed a lullaby, the kind of simple melody handed down from mother to daughter, from elder to child, soft and almost broken. The child stilled at once. His tiny fists loosened. He seemed to lean toward the sound, as if it were the first thread tying him gently to this world. Time drifted, as softly as a feather falling through air. The nights passed, and always he lay near the cracked window of that small house, the one where starlight slipped in as if it belonged to him. On some evenings the glass trembled with the wind, and when it did, he would quiet instantly, as though listening to the vibration itself. Those who cared for him spoke in murmurs about this oddity, wondering if perhaps he was attuned to things unseen. Yet they did not forbid it. They let him rest there, pressed close to the window, where the world beyond whispered its unspoken language. He did not cry much. Instead, he would fix his gaze on the shadows moving across the walls, as if he could trace their stories. A caretaker once muttered that the boys seemed too patient for one so young, and perhaps she was right. Patience grew in him like roots beneath soil, unnoticed, slow, but steady. What others dismissed as strangeness was already shaping into something else, something deeper, the quiet core of who he would become. At times he would clutch at the smallest things, threads of a worn blanket, the faint hum of a moth against the window, the creak of wood in the dark. And in those moments he seemed almost content, as if the tiniest fragments of the world were enough. He absorbed them the way others might drink water, holding them inside, building a private universe no one else could see. And though no one could explain it, there were nights when his caretakers swore they heard faint echoes in the stillness, not voices exactly, not words, but a rhythm, like something calling from far away. When they turned toward the child, he would already be awake, staring into the crack in the window pane, his eyes wide and calm. He did not cry. He did not smile. He simply listened, as though he had been waiting for this moment, as though he had always known it would come. This was his beginning, not with fanfare nor with tragedy, but with an unanswered whisper pressed into him on the very night he entered the world. And even then, before language had found him, before time had hardened him, he seemed to carry that whisper as a secret flame, one that would guide his steps into the long, strange journey ahead. As the boy grew into the first years of childhood, the cracked window became more than a frame of glass. It was a silent companion, a portal that shaped his nights and softened his days. He would sit cross-legged before it, his small hands pressed lightly against the cool surface, as though seeking to feel the pulse of the world beyond. The glass never answered, not with words, not with gestures, but in its quiet way it spoke, the tremor of wind against it, the faint, scattering of raindrops, the distant vibration of thunder traveling miles to reach him. Each sound left an imprint, each whisper became a part of him. Others might have forgotten the window, treating it as nothing more than a broken pane in an old house. But to him it was alive. He believed the thin crack that ran across its surface was not a flaw, but a pathway, something that allowed the world outside to seep in more easily. He would tilt his head, tracing the line of the crack with his eyes, watching how moonlight slid across it in silver streaks. He began to imagine that the crack was listening too, carrying his small sighs and half-formed murmurs outward into the dark expanse of night. The caretakers often found him there, unmoving for longer than seemed natural. At first, they tried to draw him away, worried that the cold might harm him, but soon they realized he would not be persuaded. Even when lifted gently into bed, he would find his way back, as if drawn by a tether only he could feel. So they allowed it, letting him keep his vigil at the glass. In time, they grew accustomed to the sight, a boy with solemn eyes pressed to a fragile window, watching the world without speaking a word. It was not loneliness that held him there, though to others it may have seemed so. Rather, it was a kind of recognition, as though in the distant fields of stars, in the shifting shapes of clouds, in the trembling of the wind itself, he found pieces of himself reflected back. He did not yet have the language to explain it, but inside he felt an endless patience, the sense that the universe would reveal itself if only he stayed long enough to notice. One night, as the house lay quiet and his caretakers drifted in sleep, he leaned against the window and whispered a question. It was not a word he had been taught, nor one he could repeat if asked. It was something softer, a murmur born from instinct, rising from the strange hush inside him. For a moment, nothing stirred. But then the glass shivered faintly, and a small draught brushed his cheek, carrying with it the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. His eyes widened, though he made no sound. He simply leaned closer, as though to say he understood. From that night onward, he began to share more with the window. Little fragments of his days, quiet thoughts he never voiced aloud, were given to the glass as if it were listening. He told it of the caretaker's song, of the taste of warm bread, of the moths he tried not to harm when they brushed against his hands. In return, the window gave him silence, but it was not an empty silence. It was a silence that held space, that absorbed what he offered and returned it in the form of stillness, a calm deeper than sleep. As seasons changed, the window became his first teacher. From it he learned that the world shifted endlessly, yet always returned. Rain darkened the sky, but then stars appeared again. Branches bent with snow, but soon leaves emerged, fragile and green. He saw all this through the thin, imperfect glass, and in his quiet way he began to trust in cycles, in the rhythm of things unseen yet certain. It was a lesson he would carry for all the years to come, though he could not yet know how much it would shape him. One evening he pressed his palm flat against the pane and saw his reflection beside the sky. For the first time he noticed how his face blurred into the stars, how his small form seemed almost to dissolve into the dark. A quiet thought stirred in him then, one too large for his age, yet it did not frighten him. It soothed him instead. Perhaps he was not separate from the world beyond the glass. Perhaps he had always been part of it, waiting to remember. He lingered there until sleep claimed him, his head resting lightly against the window, his breath clouding the fragile surface. And in that half-dreaming state he felt the faintest impression. Nights passed gently, one after another, and the boy remained faithful to the quiet companionship of the window. Yet even as he listened, To the unspoken language of glass and stars, another thread wove itself through his childhood, one that carried warmth deeper than any silence could. It was the sound of a lullaby, fragile and imperfect, hummed by the caretaker, who tended him when the house sank into stillness. At first, the melodies drifted only faintly, no more than a murmur in the air, but soon he began to wait for them, leaning against the window until the soft singing found him. When it did, something in him always calmed, as though the song were stitching together a loneliness he had not yet understood. He never grasped the words fully. Some verses were too old, their syllables worn smooth like river stones, but meaning was never in the words. The meaning came in the pauses, in the ache of a breath taken before a note, in the gentleness with which the tune circled back to where it had begun. He felt it settle in him like warmth settling into a blanket, a warmth not of fire, but of belonging. And though he could not sing, he would hum to himself in the long hours when the caretaker's voice faded, holding on to fragments of the melody the way others might cling to light. Often, when he fell into half-sleep by the window, the lullaby and the whispers of the night would blur together. The hum of song and the hum of wind merged, creating a music that seemed to belong neither to the world within nor the world beyond. In those moments, he believed he could hear something larger, like the sky itself joining the tune, low and endless, carrying him toward dreams that felt less like inventions and more like memories of a place he had once known. He would close his eyes and drift, the cracked window against his cheek, lulled into sleep not by comfort alone, but by the feeling that he was being kept safe by forces he could not see. The lullabies became rituals, repeated not with grandeur but with quiet persistence. They taught him that even fragile things endure, that even voices worn thin can still carry love. Each song left its trace, and he gathered those traces silently, adding them to the collection of unseen treasures he was building inside himself. He did not yet know that this habit of holding on to what others discarded or overlooked would become the foundation of his strength. All he knew was that when the lullaby came, the world seemed gentler, and when it ceased, the silence seemed kinder for having held it. As days stretched into years, the caretaker's songs grew fewer, the voice sometimes fading before the tune could complete itself. Yet he did not mourn these absences. Instead, he carried what he remembered, humming quietly in the spaces left behind. It was as if he had inherited the task of keeping the melodies alive, not for anyone else but for himself and the window that still listened faithfully at his side. He began to understand that memory itself could be a form of music, that even when a voice was gone, the echo remained, lingering like the faint scent of rain on dry earth. One evening, when clouds pressed heavily against the sky and the room was darker than usual, he found himself humming without realizing it. The sound was fragile, a thin echo of the caretaker's song, but it was his own. For the first time, he heard his voice mingling with the hush of the window, and it startled him. Yet the glass did not tremble away from him. It held his reflection steady, as if to tell him he belonged to the song as much as to the silence. That night, for the first time, he did not simply receive the lullaby, he became part of it, carrying it forward in the small, steady hum of his own breath. The boy slept deeply after that, and in his sleep he dreamed not of endings but of continuations. He saw himself standing beneath the moons again, but this time he was not alone. The lullaby followed him there, weaving through the dream like a thread of light. And when he woke, he felt certain of something, though he could not put it into words, that music, however fragile, would never truly leave him. It would guide him, shape him, carry him through the next unfolding of his days, just as the window and its whispering silence had carried him this far. The morning after he first heard his own voice mingling with the lullaby, something subtle shifted in the way he moved through the world. He carried the sound with him, quiet and unfinished, like a secret note pressed into his palm. The days were simple: bread shared at the table, the soft creak of wooden floors, the smell of rain-soaked earth carried in on boots. But within those small moments, he began to act differently. Where once he had only watched, now he reached out. Where once he had sat in silence, now he offered. His kindness did not arrive with ceremony, but like water finding its own way through soil, gently and without effort. It began with something so small it might have gone unnoticed, a piece of bread he had saved from his own plate, broken into halves and offered to another child who had none. There was no grand gesture, no words of explanation, only the quiet act itself, as natural as breathing. The other child took it with wide eyes, and though nothing more was spoken, the boy felt warmth bloom in his chest, warmer even than the lullabies. He wondered if this too was a kind of music, the soft song of giving without demand. From then on, his days seemed to fill with such gestures. When he noticed a moth struggling in a bowl of water, he cupped it gently in his hands and held it to the air until its wings dried. When the caretaker sighed under the weight of endless tasks, he gathered kindling without being asked, his small hands clutching twigs as though they were treasures. He did not think of these things as duties. To him they felt like conversations, exchanges with the world as true as the whispers from the window and the lullabies at night. Even food, the simplest of comforts, became part of this quiet exchange. On afternoons, when bread and cheese were placed before him, he would eat slowly, pausing often to set aside a piece. Sometimes he gave it to another child, sometimes to a stray animal that lingered near the edge of the yard, and sometimes he left it on the windowsill, as if the stars themselves might one day come down and taste it. When asked why, he only shrugged, unable to explain that he felt the world grew kinder when something was shared. There were evenings when he sat alone, a small sandwich resting in his hands, and he imagined himself offering it to the vastness beyond the cracked glass. In his mind, the stars bent closer, not because they hungered, but because they wished to feel what kindness was. He pictured them taking a crumb and glowing more warmly for it. It made him smile softly, a smile not seen often, but one that lingered long after. To those who watched him, his actions seemed strange, who saved food for the sky. Yet no one stopped him. Perhaps they sensed it was not strangeness at all, but a language still forming, a way of speaking to things greater than himself. The world responded in its own way. Birds lingered near him longer than with others. Cats wound themselves around his legs with uncommon ease. Even the caretaker, weary as she was, sometimes paused and looked at him with softened eyes, as if the quiet patience in him reminded her of something she had once known and nearly forgotten. Though he did not seek recognition, he absorbed these moments with the same stillness he gave to the window. He was learning that kindness was not always met with words, but often with silence that carried understanding. At night, when he returned to the cracked pane, his reflections deepened. He would sit with his hands pressed lightly to the glass, remembering the bread shared, the moth saved, the warmth he had seen flicker in another's eyes. And as he remembered, he hummed softly to himself, weaving the day's gestures into the thread of the lullaby he carried within. It became a ritual, the kindness of the day folding into the music of the night, a circle unbroken. He began to sense that this was how his life would unfold, not in sudden leaps or dramatic turns, but in the layering of small, quiet acts, each building gently upon the last. On one such night, as he drifted into sleep with the window's cool surface against his skin, he dreamed again. This time he saw the stars not as distant fires, but as companions sitting across from him at a table, each one listening as he slid a piece of bread toward them. None of them spoke, yet he felt their gratitude fill the room, vast and wordless. When he awoke, the dream clung to him like a tender echo, and he carried it forward into the morning, certain in a way he could not explain that the world was listening to every kindness, no matter how small. The boy carried the dream of feeding stars into his waking hours, and it changed how he saw the days that followed. Each morning seemed longer, not because of weariness, but because his thoughts stretched further, like threads pulling him gently beyond the edges of what was near. Where other children hurried and laughed with careless bursts, he moved slowly, watching the way shadows bent along walls, the way light shifted across floors as if it too were a living thing. Time did not rush him. Time seemed to wait, and in that waiting he learned to listen more deeply. His patience grew into something almost visible. The caretaker noticed it when he sat for hours beside the old wooden table, stacking crumbs of bread into little shapes, only to scatter them again without complaint. She noticed when storms came, rattling the shutters, and while others hid beneath blankets, he sat by the window and counted the seconds between thunder and lightning, not with fear, but with quiet wonder. He was not immune to discomfort. He shivered, he tired, he longed, but he met these feelings with the same calm that he gave to moths, to rain, to the silence of the night. They became part of him rather than obstacles against him. This strange adaptability became clearer when he was asked to do tasks he had never done before. One evening, the caretaker handed him a basket heavier than his arms were used to holding, filled with apples just picked from the orchard. He staggered, almost fell, but instead of giving up, he shifted the basket against his chest and walked slower, adjusting step by step until the weight no longer frightened him. It took twice as long to reach the table as it should have, but when he set the basket down, he smiled faintly, as though the rhythm of carrying it had been worth more than the act itself. From that day, the caretaker began to trust him with more, sensing that his strength was not in speed, but in persistence. Even in play, this adaptability showed itself. When other children quarreled over who should lead their games, he never pushed to be first. He bent instead, changing his role to suit the moment, slipping into spaces others left behind. If they needed someone to listen, he listened. If they needed silence, he grew still. And though they did not always understand him, they began to rely on the quiet certainty of his presence, the way one might rely on a steady flame in the dark. He himself did not think of these traits as skills. To him, they felt natural, as though he were made not of rigid lines, but of water, ready to take the shape of whatever vessel the day poured him into. He did not resist change. He let it guide him. Even when difficulties pressed against him, he seemed to fold without breaking, to bend without losing himself. This became his quiet power, though neither he nor those around him had yet given it a name. At night, he still returned to the cracked window, humming the lullabies he remembered, weaving into them the lessons of each day. Sometimes he hummed the sound of carrying a basket. Sometimes he hummed the rhythm of rain. Sometimes he hummed the shape of silence itself. It was his way of gathering the world into something whole, of softening every sharp edge by folding it into song. And as he drifted into sleep, he often dreamt of stretching his arms, his days, his very self, longer and softer, as if to meet everything the world gave him with open hands. The dreams left him with a curious certainty when morning returned. He began to believe that no matter what weight came, no matter what shape it asked him to take, he would find a way to hold it, not by fighting, not by conquering, but by adapting slowly, gently, as if even the hardest things could be softened if approached with enough patience. The others around him did not yet know it, but this was how he would continue to grow. A boy of stillness, of small kindnesses, of bending without breaking, quietly preparing for the larger burdens the world would one day ask of him. It was during those years when his patience had become as natural as breath that another presence began to lean quietly into his life. An older man, with shoulders that carried the sag of long days and eyes that seemed to hold both weariness and depth, appeared more often in the corners of the boy's days. He was not a parent, nor exactly a caretaker, but someone who lingered near the household, fixing what was broken, tending what others overlooked. His voice was seldom raised, his words never wasted. To most, he was little more than a figure moving in the background. To the boy, however, he was different. The boy noticed that when the man worked, he carried the same stillness that the boy felt in himself. He hammered nails without hurry, mended tools without complaint, and paused often, not out of fatigue, but out of thought, as though he was listening to something inside the silence. The boy found himself drawn to this, watching closely whenever the man was near. At first he only watched from a distance, his eyes following the rhythm of hands that moved carefully, never forceful. Over time, curiosity pulled him nearer, until he was close enough to see how each wrinkle in the man's face deepened when he smiled faintly at a task completed. The man, too, began to notice the boy's quiet presence. He would glance up from his work to find those patient eyes fixed upon him, unblinking, absorbing. Unlike the others, the boy never fidgeted, never asked for entertainment. He only stood, still and attentive, as if the act of watching was its own kind of learning. One evening, perhaps moved by the boy's persistence, the man placed a small tool into his hand, a simple piece of wood, worn smooth with use. The boy accepted it without a word, as though he had been waiting for this moment. From then on, he followed the man more closely, carrying the tool wherever he went, unsure of its full purpose, but certain it meant something. What unfolded between them was not teaching in the way most would expect. There were no lectures, no lessons drawn on chalk, no loud corrections. Instead, there were long silences shared side by side, broken only by the sound of hands working. The boy would imitate quietly, fumbling at first, but the man never scolded. When a mistake was made, he would simply take the object, turn it gently, and show another way, letting the boy see rather than hear. The boy learned more through these gestures than words ever could have given him. He learned that patience could build more than character. It could build shelter, repair tools, and restore things thought broken. The more time they spent together, the more the boy felt that the man was teaching him something far greater than the tasks themselves. In the way the man paused before striking a nail, in the way he brushed away sawdust with care as if the wood deserved respect, the boy saw a lesson about living. That strength did not have to roar, that wisdom did not have to shout, that sometimes the truest way to shape the world was not through power, but through quiet attention. Evenings became their unspoken ritual. When the day's labor was done, they often sat on the worn steps outside, watching the last light soften into dusk. The man seldom spoke, but when he did, the boy listened with the same stillness he gave to the cracked window. The words were simple, yet they carried weight. "Hold steady," the man once said, as the boy struggled to balance a length of wood. The boy thought he meant only the task, but later, lying against the window pane, he realized the words belonged to life itself. In time, the boy began to hum the caretaker's lullabies while working beside the man, not loudly, but low enough that only the two of them could hear. The man never asked him to stop. Instead, he let the songs fill the air, weaving into the rhythm of their labor. Something unspoken grew between them, a bond not of blood nor obligation, but of recognition. They were two souls who understood silence, who knew how to listen to the spaces between things, and in that recognition, the boy felt less alone. The presence of this mentor deepened the boy's patience into something steadier, something more certain. He no longer felt that he was only waiting by the window for whispers to come. Now he was learning how to carry that listening into the daylight, into tasks, into the fabric of his growing life. And though he could not have known it then, the lessons taught by the man with tired eyes would linger in him for many years to come, shaping the way he met the world long after those evenings had faded into memory. The evenings with the man became a rhythm the boy cherished, a quiet pattern of learning and silence. But the balance of his days began to shift when another presence entered his small world. She was a child like him, though different in ways that drew his attention immediately. Where he was quiet, she was curious. Where he held his thoughts inward, she scattered hers into the air with questions that tumbled over each other. At first, her brightness startled him. He had grown used to the stillness of wood and glass, the steady patience of the man with tired eyes, the soft comfort of lullabies fading into night. Yet this new voice, this laughter that rang out like water against stone, seemed to demand he step out of silence and meet it. Their first meeting was nothing marked or remarkable. She appeared by the orchard one afternoon, crouching in the grass to gather fallen apples, humming a tune of her own invention. He watched from a distance, uncertain whether to approach. She noticed him without hesitation and called him closer with a wave, her voice carrying warmth that brooked no refusal. He obeyed, not out of eagerness, but out of the same instinct that had once led him to the cracked window, the feeling that something was waiting to be heard. It did not take long for him to realize that she carried her own kind of patience, though it wore a different shape. She asked questions he could not answer, and when he failed to respond, she did not grow frustrated. She simply waited, filling the silence with her own musings until he finally nodded or offered a single, spare word. She seemed to understand that his silences were not refusals, but spaces he needed to breathe. And in this understanding, she became the first true companion of his childhood. They began to spend hours together, sitting beneath the trees or wandering the worn paths that circled the house. She told him stories she had half heard from elders, reshaping them with her imagination until they became something entirely new. He listened, as he always had, his patience absorbing every detail. And when her stories stumbled or drifted, he gently guided them back with a single question or a steady gaze. She, in turn, laughed at his seriousness, tugging him into small games, coaxing out the faintest of smiles. It was as though they had discovered a rhythm between them, her voice filling the air, his silence anchoring it. One evening, she sat beside him at the window where he always kept his watch. The cracked glass reflected their faces side by side, hers animated with curiosity, his steady as ever. She pressed her hand against the pane and whispered a secret, something small and fleeting, and then asked if he ever spoke to the window. He did not answer immediately, but the way his eyes softened told her enough. She leaned her head against his shoulder then, content to share the silence he carried. For the first time, he felt the window was not his alone. In her presence, he began to test the edges of himself. He found words he had never thought to use, fragments of thought spoken aloud for her ears alone. They were not many, but they were enough, and she received each one as though it were treasure. In return, she offered him her laughter, her stories, her unguarded heart. The bond between them grew, not through grand gestures, but through countless small moments. An apple split between their hands, a song hummed out of tune, the steady comfort of companionship when the world felt too large. He had learned patience from the window, kindness from the lullabies, adaptability from the burdens he carried, and attention from the man with tired eyes. Now, through her, he was learning connection. She taught him that silence could be shared, that words did not always need to be many, that even the simplest act of being present with another could shape the day into something lasting. And so, as night returned and the stars stretched themselves above the cracked glass, the boy no longer leaned alone against the window. Two reflections glimmered side by side, softened by starlight, carrying within them the first threads of a friendship that would echo long after childhood had passed. Their companionship deepened in ways that neither of them had words for, a gentle thread weaving itself into the fabric of their days. Where once the boy's world had been the rhythm of silence and whispers, now it was coloured by her voice, her laughter, and the questions she scattered like seeds. Yet it was in their shared dreams that the bond grew most alive. They did not dream only at night, but also in the quiet of afternoons, sitting by the stream that ran beyond the orchard, or beneath the low branches of trees that bent toward them like listening guardians. They dreamed aloud, inventing fragile futures and shaping them with the same care a child gives to folded paper. One day she taught him how to crease a scrap of paper into the shape of a boat. Her fingers moved quickly, folding and pressing with confidence, then setting the small craft upon the surface of the stream. The boy watched as the boat wobbled, then steadied, drifting slowly along the current. His eyes followed it until it slipped around the bend and was lost. She laughed and pressed another scrap of paper into his hands, urging him to try. His folds were clumsy at first, but the boat held together, and when it floated beside hers, something inside him eased. The sight of those small vessels, fragile, unremarkable, yet moving, felt like a quiet promise. From then on, they filled their days with these paper boats, setting them afloat in every pool, puddle, and stream they could find. Some sank quickly, others drifted farther than expected, but each one carried a fragment of their dreams, stories whispered over the folds, wishes pressed into the paper before it touched the water. They never spoke of where the boats might go, yet both felt they travelled somewhere important, carrying a part of themselves beyond the limits of the orchard and the cracked window. In the evenings, when they sat together at the window's edge, they imagined their boats reaching the stars. She would point to a cluster of lights in the sky and declare that one of their boats had already arrived, transformed into starlight. He would listen, his silence stretching between her words, but his eyes softened in a way that told her he believed her. It became a ritual, folding boats, releasing them, then waiting for the night to gather them into constellations. Through these small acts, the boy began to see dreams not as something distant or unreachable, but as things carried gently forward, like boats upon a current. They did not need to arrive quickly, nor did they need to survive every storm. It was enough that they were set afloat at all, enough that they held meaning in the moments before they vanished. This understanding lingered in him long after the paper dissolved, a quiet lesson about hope, fragility, and endurance. And so, while the world beyond remained vast and uncertain, within their small circle of window, orchard, and stream, the two children built something that felt enduring. Their dreams drifted outward like countless little vessels, fragile yet brave, carrying the softness of their bond into places unseen. And though they could not yet know it, these drifting fragments would one day return to them in ways neither could have imagined, shaping paths that would stretch far beyond the reach of childhood. The days of folded paper drifting into streams and stars became a quiet season of their lives, but as with all seasons, change came, subtle at first, then steady. The boy began to notice that not all moments offered the lightness of laughter or the ease of shared dreams. There were times when others around them faltered, when harsh words were spoken, when small cruelties slipped into the air like thorns. In those moments, he felt a stirring inside himself, a pull toward choice. He could turn away and let the silence shield him, or he could step forward and meet the heaviness with the same gentleness he gave to boats, moths, and windows. It began with something seemingly small. A younger child, clumsy and uncertain, dropped a basket of apples in the yard. The fruit rolled in every direction, some bruised by the fall. Others laughed, pointing their amusement quick and sharp. The boy stood apart at first, his gaze steady, his instinct to remain in silence. Yet something in him resisted the laughter. He moved slowly into the yard, gathered the apples without a word, and placed them back into the child's trembling hands. The laughter quieted. The boy said nothing, but the way he met the child's eyes, calm, without judgment, carried more weight than words could have. The moment passed, small on the surface, yet deep within him it settled as a choice made, one that mattered. He began to notice how often such choices presented themselves. When quarrels rose among children, he did not feed them. When someone was left alone, he sat nearby, even if he said nothing. His presence became its own kind of offering, a steady hand in a world quick to waver. The girl who folded boats with him noticed this first. She told him once, half whispering under the orchard's shade, that he carried silence like armor. But unlike armor, it did not push others away, it drew them closer. He did not answer, but he carried her words with him, letting them rest beside the lullabies and whispers that already lived inside his heart. These choices did not always come easily. There were moments when his quiet defiance placed him apart, when others looked at him with confusion, wondering why he did not join in their laughter or their anger. He felt the weight of being different, of standing still when others surged forward. Yet he did not waver. His patience had become more than waiting. It had become a strength that allowed him to hold to what was right, even when it was not understood. And though he could not name it yet, he was learning the shape of compassion, how it required not only kindness but courage, how it asked him to carry burdens not his own. At night, when he leaned again against the cracked window, he thought of these moments. The glass, the stars, the faint hum of his own lullabies seemed to fold them into something larger, as though the universe itself was keeping record of the choices he made. He wondered if each small act of compassion was like a paper boat, fragile, perhaps forgotten by others, but carried nonetheless to places unseen. He thought of the child with trembling hands, of quarrels eased by stillness, of silences shared, and he felt that all of it was drifting outward, rippling into a wider current he could not yet imagine. The girl remained beside him through it all, her laughter softening the weight when it grew heavy. Together they still launched boats into the stream, but now the boy carried something deeper within him, something that gave those boats new meaning. They were no longer only dreams. They were choices, folded carefully into fragile vessels, set afloat with the hope that even the smallest kindness might find its way to a distant shore. The weight of compassion began to rest more heavily on him, as the seasons turned, yet alongside it another presence stirred, quieter but no less demanding, the weight of words he never spoke. With each choice he made in silence, with each kindness carried without explanation, something gathered within him like letters left unwritten. He felt it most in the moments when the girl sat beside him, her voice carrying easily into the spaces he left unfilled. She would tell him stories, share her small fears, or laugh at the tilt of the sky, and he would listen, steady as always. But when her eyes lingered on him, waiting for more than a nod or a faint smile, he felt the silence stretch thin, trembling under the things he could not bring himself to say. At night, this silence became heavier. He leaned against the cracked window as he always had and pressed his forehead to the cool glass. The stars blinked back at him, patient but distant, and he wished he could send them the words he held inside. Words of gratitude to the caretaker who hummed broken lullabies, words of recognition to the man with tired eyes who had shown him another way of being, words of affection for the girl whose laughter had become part of his days. None of these words passed his lips. Instead, they turned inward, circling within him like birds searching for a place to land. One evening, when the air was sharp with the first edge of autumn, he took up scraps of paper left unused from the boats they had folded. Alone in his room, he began to write, not in full sentences, for his thoughts came haltingly, but in fragments, a single phrase for the caretaker, a memory for the man, a question for the girl. He did not plan to give these pages to anyone. He only folded them carefully and hid them away, tucking them between the boards of the floor, as if the act of writing was enough to release the pressure of holding them. Yet even as he hid them, he felt a pang of longing. These were not meant only for himself. They were meant to be shared, but the courage to do so never fully came. The girl noticed his quietness growing heavier, though she did not press him. Instead, she began to share more of herself, perhaps hoping her words might coax his into daylight. She spoke of dreams she could not explain, of fears she carried in her small hands, of the way she sometimes felt the stars were listening. He would sit beside her, still and steady, but inside he ached with the desire to answer, to let her know that he too carried those thoughts, that he too felt the world whispering. Yet the words clung to him stubbornly like dew that refuses to fall. It was not that he feared rejection. It was that his silence had become a part of him, a shape he did not know how to step outside of. His voice felt too fragile, too uncertain, and he worried that once released, the words might break or vanish. So he kept them close, letting them fill the pages of hidden letters, letting them settle like dust along the cracked window pane. And though he said little, his actions grew all the more deliberate, an apple placed gently in her hands, a task finished quietly before she could attempt it, a steady presence whenever shadows of doubt crossed her face. But even he began to sense that this balance could not hold forever. The silence that had once protected him now pressed like a shadow at his back, urging him forward. The boats they set afloat still drifted outward, carrying their dreams, but he knew there were words inside him heavier than paper, words that would not dissolve so easily. He did not yet know when they would rise, or how, but he felt the certainty that one day they must. And as the autumn deepened and the nights grew longer, the boy leaned against the window with his unwritten letters and felt the pull of a future that demanded more than silence could hold. The weight of unsent words lingered with him, and it seemed the world itself began to mirror his restlessness. The sky grew restless too, filling with clouds that shifted in strange ways, their edges gleaming with colors that did not belong to ordinary sunsets. On some nights, he would sit by the cracked window and see shapes forming above him, arches of light bending like hidden doors across the heavens, faint but unmistakable. They did not open fully, yet their presence pressed upon him like a question waiting for an answer. He felt that if he only listened long enough, if he only dared to reach beyond silence, those doors might reveal where they led. He told no one about these visions. Not the caretaker with her fading lullabies, not the man with tired eyes, not even the girl whose laughter had always loosened the heaviness of his days. It was not secrecy born of mistrust, but of uncertainty. He did not know whether the doors were real or imagined, whether they were invitations or warnings. So he watched them in solitude, pressing his forehead against the cool pane of glass, tracing their outlines with his breath as though mapping a path he could not yet take. The girl noticed the way his gaze shifted upward more often, how his silences grew deeper, stretched tighter, as if filled with something too heavy to remain unspoken. One evening, she asked him what he saw when he stared so long at the sky. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words clinging stubbornly to his chest. Instead, he folded a scrap of paper into a boat and handed it to her, pressing it gently into her palm. She studied it, waiting, but when no explanation came, she only nodded, as if to say she would keep his silence safe. Yet in her eyes there was a glimmer of curiosity and perhaps a trace of worry, for she could feel that something beyond her reach was drawing him away. As autumn deepened into early winter, the doors in the sky appeared more clearly. Once, when the air was sharp and the orchard lay bare, he saw a shimmer open wide enough that he felt a pull in his chest, as though the world itself had exhaled through that opening. The moment lasted only a breath, then vanished, leaving him trembling, not with fear, but with recognition. He did not yet know what it meant, only that it was tied to the same quiet flame that had burned within him since the night of his birth. That night, he could not sleep. He sat with scraps of paper spread across the floor, writing more letters he would never send, his hand moving faster than ever before. Fragments of questions, fragments of longing, fragments of words meant for those he loved but could not speak aloud. When he finished, he tucked them into the same hiding place beneath the floorboards, then returned to the window. The sky was calm again, no doors visible, yet he pressed his hand to the glass as though sealing a promise. He knew now that silence alone would not carry him forward. There would come a time when he would have to step through to answer whatever it was that called from beyond. The stars blinked patiently above him, as though waiting. The cracked window held his reflection steady, but for the first time he did not see only himself. He saw possibility, the faint outline of paths hidden just beyond reach, waiting for him to choose. And though the night gave no answers, he felt the certainty of change gathering, as inevitable as the turn of seasons. The shimmer of doors in the sky never truly left him, even when the nights returned to stillness. They lived inside his thoughts, pressing against his silence in ways he could not escape. As he grew older, the days themselves began to stretch differently. Where once he had found comfort in the patterns of orchard, stream, and window, now those familiar paths seemed longer, more distant, as if time itself had widened the space between each step. He felt a restlessness beneath his patience, a pull that asked him to keep walking even when there was nowhere new to go. The girl noticed it first, the way he lingered at the edges of fields as though measuring the horizon, the way his gaze travelled beyond their familiar hills. She teased him lightly at times, calling him a dreamer, but her laughter carried a softness, for she knew it was not idle fantasy that held him. It was something deeper, something that seemed to grow heavier in his chest with every passing season. He would only nod at her words, yet his silence told her what his voice could not. He was caught between staying and leaving, between holding close what he knew and reaching for what lay unseen. The caretaker, too, began to notice. She found him outside more often, standing in the cold air long after dusk, his hands tucked into his sleeves as though he could steady himself by clutching his own patience. She said little, but once she hummed an old lullaby behind him, and for a moment he almost turned, almost confessed the pull he felt. Instead, he let the notes drift past him, gathering them like he always had, storing them deep inside, as if to carry them into whatever distance awaited. There were nights when he wrote more of his secret letters, his hand moving quickly, filling scraps with thoughts he dared not speak aloud. Some were addressed to the girl, some to the caretaker, some to no one at all. He folded them carefully, tucked them away, then sat again by the window, where the reflection of his own face seemed older, wearier than he expected. He pressed his hand against the crack in the glass, feeling the cool air slip through, and wondered if perhaps the window itself was urging him onward, as it had always been his first teacher, his first door to the world beyond. The man with tired eyes offered no guidance, yet in his quiet way he too became part of this restlessness. The boy watched him move through his tasks with the same patience as always, but now he saw the cost of it, the heaviness in each step, the way silence had become more of a burden than a refuge. He wondered if this was what awaited him, should he choose only to stay, if he too would one day carry that weight. The thought settled heavily, but it did not frighten him. It clarified something he had long suspected. Patience alone was not enough. Patience needed direction, and his direction lay somewhere he could not yet see. And so, as he stood again at the window on a night when the stars seemed sharper than usual, he felt both the ache of distance and the tenderness of belonging. The orchard, the lullabies, the laughter of his friend, all of it was woven into him, and he knew it would never leave. Yet the horizon called, not with urgency, but with inevitability, like a tide that slowly but surely reaches the shore. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and allowed himself to imagine, stepping beyond even if only in thought. For the first time, the act of imagining no longer felt like dreaming. It felt like preparing. The pull of the horizon lingered in him, steady as a heartbeat, but with it came another realization, one more difficult to bear. Time was no longer the soft and endless river it had once been in childhood. It had begun to show its edges, to reveal its fragility in ways both subtle and sharp. He noticed it first in the caretaker, whose hands trembled slightly when she carried baskets, whose lullabies faltered before the final note. He noticed it in the man with tired eyes, whose silences grew heavier, whose pauses stretched longer, as if each task required more from him than it once had. Even the girl, though still bright, carried shadows behind her laughter, moments when she turned away too quickly, moments when her voice fell quiet, as though weighed by thoughts she would not share. The boy, now older, felt these changes press against him like the ticking of a clock he could not see but could hear faintly, always in the background. At night, when the house was silent, he would lie awake listening to the creaks of wood and the settling of beams, each sound reminding him of passing hours, of the slow wear that touched everything. He thought of the cracked window pane, how it had held for so long yet bore the mark of fracture, and he began to understand that not everything broken could be repaired. Some things endured as they were, imperfect yet still present. This recognition brought no despair, but it carried a weight he had not known before. One evening the girl asked him if he ever wished things would stay the same forever. He looked at her, at the light in her face softened by dusk. And though the words pressed against his throat, he only shook his head. He did not wish for forever, not any more. He had come to see that forever was not possible, that time's hand pressed forward regardless of longing. What he wished instead was that he might learn to carry change as gently as he carried moths from the water, that he might find a way to hold what slipped through his fingers without breaking beneath the loss. The seasons taught him this lesson in their own slow way. The orchard bore fruit, then lay bare. The streams ran high with spring, then dwindled to thin ribbons by late summer. Even the paper boats he and the girl set afloat dissolved quickly, leaving only ripples behind. Yet those ripples lingered, spreading outward long after the boats were gone, and in them he found comfort. Perhaps people too were like that, fragile vessels that could not last, yet whose presence sent waves outward, touching shores they would never see. Still, the ache of time deepened. He began to feel it within himself, in the quiet longing that swelled whenever he wrote his secret letters. The pages piled higher, filled with words he could not speak, and he wondered if perhaps this was how people carried the passing of years, by holding on to fragments, by keeping memories alive in silence, even when they could not stop the clocks from turning. At times, he wanted to release them, to hand the letters to those who had shaped his days, but his silence held firm. It was not fear anymore. It was the understanding that some things could only be carried, not resolved. And so, when he stood once more at the window, watching the sky tremble, with faint outlines of unseen doors, he felt both the burden and the beauty of time. The crack in the glass reminded him that nothing was untouched by wear, but the stars beyond reminded him that even the broken could hold light. He leaned against the pane, listening to the faint ticking within himself, and whispered, not words meant to change anything, but words meant simply to exist. I will carry it. The glass held his reflection steady, and the stars above seemed to flicker in quiet agreement, as if they, too, knew that broken clocks still kept time, just in their own uneven way. There was a day, quiet, unremarkable by most measures, when he realized something had changed inside him. It was not a moment marked by thunder or revelation, but a slow warmth rising in his chest, steady and unfamiliar. It came while he was walking alone through the orchard, leaves brittle beneath his steps, the air just sharp enough to sting the edges of breath. He paused beside one of the older trees, the bark scarred and the branches nearly bare, and without understanding why, he placed his palm against the trunk and simply stood there. Something in him recognized the tree's weariness. Not pity, never that, but kinship. That warmth, what he would later come to think of as a flame, did not announce itself. It simply was. A quiet pulse behind his ribs, a small light that neither flickered nor demanded. It stayed with him through the rest of the day, and the next, and the one after, present in the background of every task and silence. It was not joy exactly, nor sorrow. It was something steadier, something whole, and with it came a new kind of knowing. He could still be quiet, still carry the weight of time and memory, but now he could also give something more. He began to notice how others leaned toward him, not just the girl, whose presence had always been woven with his, but others too. A younger child with a bent posture and down-turned eyes sought him out during meal times. A boy quick to anger slowed in his presence, waiting longer before speaking. Even the man with tired eyes seemed to rest more easily when he stood nearby, as though some burden had been shared without needing to be named. He said little still, but what he gave now was more than silence. It was steadiness, and within that a quiet warmth that asked nothing and welcomed everything. The girl noticed, though she didn't name it at first. She only began to sit closer during the colder evenings, their shoulders sometimes touching as they watched the stars emerge. She would speak of strange dreams and distant futures, and he would listen, the flame in his chest humming in response to her voice. She began to call him Steady Light in jest, though her tone carried a softness that told him it wasn't a joke. He would smile, faint and fleeting, but it stayed longer in his eyes than it had before. There were nights when the flame felt sharper, as though something within him wished to rise, to speak, to reach outward. He would write more of his letters then, but they were changing too, less filled with longing, more filled with quiet truths. "I am still here," he wrote once, not to anyone in particular, "and something inside me refuses to go out." He folded the note, placed it with the others, but this time he left it only half hidden, as if allowing it to be found was part of the message. He began helping the man with tasks more frequently, not because he was asked, but because the work itself steadied him. He learned how to repair what had splintered, how to bind wood without force, how to listen, not just with ears, but with hands. The man said little, but one day, as they sat in the dim light of dusk, he passed the boy a small tool worn smooth with years of use. "Yours now," he said. Nothing more. But the weight of it in the boy's palm felt like a circle closing gently, not ending, but beginning again in another form. That night, as he sat at the window, the cracked pane catching the reflection of his face, he no longer saw a child waiting for the world to speak. He saw someone carrying a flame, not a fire to burn or consume, but a candle to hold steady against the dark. It was small, perhaps even fragile, but it was his, and it was enough to guide him forward. The light he carried, once fragile and uncertain, had begun to reach others in quiet ways, folding itself into the spaces where words often failed. It was never loud, never grand. It lived in small gestures, hands offered without hesitation, attention given without demand, a still presence that never turned away. But over time, something more delicate began to grow in the warmth of that light, something softer than friendship, more vulnerable than silence. It began with the girl, as most things in his life had. She had always been beside him in some way or another, laughing, dreaming, folding boats, filling the quiet with words when his own would not rise. But now there was a difference in how she looked at him, a question behind her gaze that no longer waited for answers, but simply remained steady and searching. He felt it before he understood it. In the way she sat closer when the nights grew cold, in how her voice quieted when she said his name, in how her hand lingered just a moment longer when they passed objects between them. At first he tried to treat it as he had treated everything, with stillness, with patience, with the safety of silence. But her presence stirred the flame in his chest in a way nothing else did. It flickered brighter when she was near, not frantic, but sure. When she spoke, he wanted to answer. When she laughed, he wanted to protect the sound. And when she fell into silence, he felt the weight of it, not as emptiness, but as invitation. They spent more time in the orchard, walking without purpose, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. One afternoon, she brought 2 folded boats to the stream and handed him one without a word. But this time, before releasing hers, she turned to him with a seriousness that startled him. "What do you think happens to them, really?" she asked, her eyes not on the water, but on him. He looked at the paper in his hand, delicate and imperfect, and for a moment the words caught in his throat. Then, with a quiet steadiness he hadn't known he possessed, he said, "I think maybe they carry what we can't say." She didn't reply, but her fingers tightened around the edges of her boat before she let it go. The water took it gently. So did he. After that, something opened between them, not like a door thrown wide, but like a thread drawn slowly through fabric, stitching a deeper bond. He began to speak more often, though still softly, and only to her. She asked questions others never dared, and he answered with truths he didn't know he'd kept. About the window, the flame, the letters never sent. She listened without interrupting, her expression full of that same steady light he'd once thought lived only inside himself. One evening, as twilight blurred the edges of the world, she reached for his hand without ceremony and held it between both of hers. Her touch was warm, but not urgent, just present. He did not pull away, he did not need to. And in that moment, he realized that the candle in his chest did not burn alone. There was another beside it now, flickering quietly in the space between them, bright enough to be felt, gentle enough not to blind. It wasn't the kind of love sung in lullabies or told in fables. It was quieter, rooted not in passion, but in trust. A love shaped by shared silences and worn-out paths, by boats folded in twilight and dreams whispered to stars. It was imperfect, like everything human, but it was real. And real, he had learned, was always more lasting than perfect. They walked home in silence that night, her hand still in his, the stars above blinking like old friends. When they reached the house, she didn't speak, didn't linger. She only looked at him for a long moment, nodded once, and disappeared inside. He stood alone in the cold for a while, the flame in his chest glowing steady and low. He felt no rush to move, no need to speak, just the quiet certainty that something within him had changed again, softly, deeply, and without return. The season turned slowly, as if reluctant to disturb what had begun to settle between them. The days grew shorter, the light more golden, and in that light they moved together, not always speaking, not always near, but always aware of each other, like two trees growing side by side, their roots quietly entangled beneath the soil. Their bond did not seek to be named, it simply lived in the space between breath and presence, a constant warmth that neither needed to question. The world around them remained unchanged in its surface details, the same orchard paths, the same creaking boards beneath the steps, the same low hum of lullabies lost to memory, but within him something had begun to align. The flame in his chest no longer felt like something he was merely protecting. It felt like something meant to be used, a light not just to carry but to offer. And in her presence, that feeling only deepened. He noticed it one afternoon as they sat beneath a tree, stripped bare by wind. The sun filtered weakly through its branches, casting lacework shadows on her face as she talked about a dream she'd had. In the dream, she was drifting in a small boat, no oars, no sail, only stars above her and a great silence all around. She hadn't been afraid, she told him, only curious, and somewhere in that dream silence she'd felt his hand resting over hers, not guiding, not anchoring, just there. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded, and she leaned her head on his shoulder as if they had rehearsed it. They hadn't. But some gestures do not need rehearsal. Some understandings arrive fully formed, having grown quietly under everything else. In the following days, he began to give more of himself to others, not in the way that demanded attention, but in the way that listened deeply. When someone dropped a bundle of sticks, he was already lifting them before the hands reached down. When voices grew sharp in the courtyard, his presence alone seemed to soften the edges. He did not speak much more than before, but now his stillness carried the weight of intention, The light inside him had become visible, not in brilliance but in quiet reliability, and people noticed, not always consciously, but enough to step closer when the days felt cold, enough to trust his presence when words failed them. The girl watched this with quiet pride. She never interrupted his silences, never tried to shape his kindness into something louder. Instead, she matched it in her own way, with laughter when things grew too heavy, with sharp observations that made him see the world differently, with stories that flickered like stars in his memory long after they were told. One night, as the wind shook the shutters and the house leaned into its own groans, they sat again by the window. The sky above was clear and endless, a scatter of stars so vivid it looked like someone had pressed salt into velvet. She looked at him and said, "I don't want to drift anymore." The words weren't dramatic, just honest. "If I'm a boat," she continued, "I want to row, even if I don't know where I'm going." He turned to her then, his eyes steady, and for the first time in all their years together, he answered without pause, "Then I'll row beside you." They didn't touch, didn't even smile. But the silence that followed was one of arrival. A moment that didn't need to declare itself because both of them already knew they had crossed into something new. Not just feeling, but direction. Not just companionship, but shared purpose. He did not yet know where they would go or what they would face or how the flame inside him would be asked to burn. But he knew now that it would not be alone, and that was enough to make the horizon feel not distant, but ready. The promise they shared, that quiet agreement to row together, settled into the rhythm of their days like a new pulse beneath everything. It did not change the world around them, not immediately, not visibly. The orchard still lost its leaves, the wind still spoke through the branches with the same gentle sorrow. The cracked window still held its long breath. But something in the air had shifted, a kind of knowing, a waiting, and yet, even in the softness of that bond, goodbye had already begun its slow approach. It started the way such things often do, not with a shout, not even with words, but with a feeling that rose up in the body before the mind could name it. He felt it first in the way she looked at the horizon differently now, longer, as though memorizing it. He noticed how she began folding fewer paper boats, how her stories paused more often in the middle, how her laughter returned slower each time it faded. When he asked if she was tired, she smiled, not dismissively, not to lie, but to protect him, and he let her. Then came the morning when the message arrived, a letter, crisp and foreign, its seal unfamiliar. She read it alone and didn't speak of it that day, but she didn't have to. He saw it in her shoulders, in the stillness of her hands, in the way she avoided the cracked window for the first time in years. That night, they didn't sit side by side. Instead, they walked to the stream where their boats had always sailed. The water moved slower now, thick with cold and leaves, but still it moved. She handed him one last folded boat, plain, without inscription. He took it gently as though it might dissolve in his hands, and they let them go together, watching the paper spin and drift in silence. She finally spoke. "It's far?" she said, meaning where she would go, but not forever. He nodded because he believed her, not because he thought she would return. Life, he'd learned, didn't always circle back, but because what they had built between them would not disappear with distance. The days after that were thin, fragile in their tenderness. They didn't pretend to be unchanged. Instead, they shared the time openly, walking longer, speaking softly, pressing the moments into memory like pressed flowers in a book. She asked him to write her a letter before she left. "Just one," she said, "but don't give it to me now." "Give it to the sky." He didn't ask what she meant, he only understood. And when the day came, cold and golden with winter sun, she stood at the edge of the road with her bag, small and worn. She looked back only once. He didn't wave, he didn't speak, but the flame in his chest glowed steady and full, and she smiled as if she felt it warm her one last time. Then she turned, and the world changed. That night, he did what she asked. He wrote her letter. It wasn't long, only what mattered. He told her about the light, about the way her presence had shaped it, made it brighter, made it real. He thanked her, though the word felt too small. And then he walked to the field, looked up at the stars, and released the page into the wind, letting it be carried wherever it might go. It didn't matter if it reached her. She already carried the words. The days after her leaving felt stretched, as though the hours themselves had been thinned and pulled too far. The spaces she had once filled, her voice, her laughter, even the weight of her silences, remained around him. But now they echoed differently, like a room emptied of furniture where every sound lingers too long. He walked the orchard paths alone, hearing her footsteps in memory. He folded paper boats by habit, but when they drifted downstream, he felt the absence of her gaze beside his. Even the cracked window seemed to hold its breath longer, as if waiting for her reflection to return. At first, he tried to fill the emptiness with routine. He worked with the man whose silences he knew well, carrying wood, mending what had worn thin, keeping his hands busy to quiet the ache in his chest. The tasks steadied him, but the ache did not fade. It settled deeper, becoming part of him, a weight he carried with the same patience he had learned for every burden. He did not resist it. Instead, he let it live inside him, as if grief itself were another teacher. At night, when the stars spread across the sky, he thought of the letter he had released into the wind. He imagined it drifting endlessly, perhaps dissolving into rain, perhaps falling somewhere far away. Yet he no longer needed to wonder if she would ever read it. He understood now that letters did not always need to reach their destination to be complete. Sometimes it was enough that they were written, that the words had finally found their shape outside the silence. Slowly, memory became less sharp. It did not vanish, nor did it soften into something weightless, but it transformed. Her absence became a presence of its own, guiding him in quiet ways. When he hesitated before helping someone, he remembered how she had folded boats without asking for permission, and he moved. When he caught himself staring at the horizon, he remembered the certainty in her eyes when she said she wanted to row, and he felt less afraid of the unknown. She was no longer beside him, but she was not gone. She lived in the choices he made, in the direction of the flame he carried, in the silence that no longer felt empty but full of echoes. The others noticed the change, though few spoke of it. The caretaker watched him more closely, her fading voice softer whenever she called his name. The man with tired eyes nodded once, as if to say he saw the difference, though he never said what it was. And those younger children who once circled him now sought him more often, as if sensing that the warmth he carried had deepened, sharpened by loss into something steadier. One evening, as he stood by the stream, the current carrying away another fragile boat, he realized he no longer felt the need to imagine it reaching the stars. It was enough to watch it drift, enough to know that every boat, every letter, every silence carried something forward, even if unseen. The ache of her absence was still there, but it no longer bent him. It shaped him, teaching him that even goodbyes could leave behind a kind of quiet defiance, a decision not to harden, not to turn away, but to remain open to the world, no matter the risk of loss. And so, when he returned to the cracked window that night, pressing his hand against the cold glass, he did not feel alone. The stars blinked back as they always had, the silence held him as it always would, and the flame in his chest glowed steady, no longer only his. He whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer, but knowing the words would be carried somewhere, perhaps into memory itself. "I'm still here," he said. The glass held the reflection of his face, and in that reflection he saw not just who he was, but who he was becoming. The days that followed settled into a quieter rhythm, but the silence was no longer the same. It was not emptiness, it was resolve, a steady decision to continue living with the gentleness he had learned, even as the world around him began to shift in harsher ways. He noticed it first in small details, voices sharper than they needed to be, disputes that lingered longer, faces marked by fatigue that seemed to spread like a shadow. The orchard no longer felt only like a place of fruit and memory. It began to resemble something else, a reminder that life could wither as easily as it could bloom. Where others answered hardship with bitterness, he did not. He could not. His nature bent him another way. When someone shouted, he listened. When someone turned away, he stepped closer. When others sought to harden themselves, he remained soft, though it cost him. At times his patience made him a target of mockery, his kindness dismissed as weakness. Yet he endured, not with pride, but with a quiet strength that grew firmer each time he chose compassion over anger. It was during these days that he found himself drawn to a place he had once avoided, a dim, forgotten corner of the settlement, a place where broken things were kept, tools without handles, baskets with frayed edges, books with pages torn loose. To most, it was a graveyard of use, a pile of what no longer served, but to him it became something else. He lingered there, touching the objects with a strange reverence, as though they too held whispers waiting to be heard. And slowly he began to mend them. A tool fitted with a new handle, a basket rewoven strand by strand, a book stitched clumsily back together. It was not about returning them to what they had been. It was about giving them life in another form. In the act of repair, he felt his own fractures soften, his own silence take shape. This place of broken things became a kind of library, not of stories written, but of stories remembered, and he began to think of it as his own. When others passed by, they sometimes left items for him to mend, and though they rarely thanked him, he noticed they returned more often than chance would allow. He did not mind their silence. He understood it. One evening, as he worked by the faint glow of a lantern, the man with tired eyes stopped at the threshold. He did not step inside. He only looked at the boy, now older, his hands steady, his eyes quiet, and said, "You keep things alive." The words were few, but they carried weight, and the boy bowed his head, understanding them as a blessing more than a compliment. In time, the forgotten corner filled with more than objects. People began to leave pieces of themselves there too. A scarf that once belonged to someone lost. A letter half burned. A toy missing its wheel. None of them asked him to mend these things, yet he kept them anyway, arranging them carefully, as though memory itself deserved a home. And in the stillness of that space, he felt closer to those who had left, closer even to the girl whose laughter still lived in his silence. The library of forgotten things grew into a sanctuary, not just for him, but for those who discovered its quiet. Some came and stayed for a while, speaking little, simply sitting among the fragments of what had been broken. Others returned in secret, leaving something behind without a word. He welcomed them all, not with questions, not with conditions, but with the steady warmth of his presence. It was in this way that his quiet defiance took shape, not by resisting the world's hardness with force, but by answering it with tenderness again and again until even the silence carried its own resilience. And at night, when he returned to the cracked window, his reflection now older, sharper, he felt no contradiction. The flame in his chest had not dimmed. If anything, it had spread, flickering gently in every mended thread, in every broken thing given another chance to be held. The stars blinked down as though they recognized it, as though they, too, knew that even in a world that frays, light can still be tended piece by piece until it becomes something whole. The library of forgotten things had begun to shape itself into more than a room of mended fragments. It became a place where the quiet could settle safely, where people entered with burdens and left a little lighter, even if they never spoke aloud what they carried. He thought this would be enough. That tending brokenness piece by piece was the role the world had quietly set for him. But then came the child. She arrived one afternoon without warning, her small frame slipping through the doorway as if she already belonged there. Her clothes were worn, her face smudged with dust, and her eyes, wide and watchful, scanned the room before finding him. She did not ask permission to stay. She simply sat among the baskets and tools, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at him as though she had been searching for him for a long time. At first he said nothing. He waited, giving her the silence he gave everyone who entered. But when the light shifted and the shadows grew longer, she finally spoke. "You fix things," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It was not a question. He nodded once. She hesitated, then lifted her sleeve just enough to reveal a toy tucked against her chest, a wooden figure, its arm missing, its paint faded into indistinct colors. She held it out with both hands, and though she did not say the words, he understood what she was asking. He took it gently, setting it on the table. His fingers traced the worn edges, and he felt the weight of it, the story it must have carried through her short years, the comfort it must have given her when voices were too sharp or nights too long. Repairing it would not erase its history. It would not make it new again, but it could be made whole in another way. He set about the work with care, piecing the arm back with glue and thread, smoothing the rough places, letting the quiet stretch around them both. When he finished, he placed the toy back in her small hands. She studied it, then clutched it tightly to her chest, her shoulders loosening as though something inside her had been returned. She did not thank him, not with words, but with the way she stayed. From that day on, she came often, always carrying the toy, always sitting nearby as he worked. Sometimes she asked questions in her halting voice. Sometimes she only hummed softly to herself, and sometimes she simply watched, her gaze steady and trusting as though his presence was enough. He had not expected this bond. It grew slowly, without demand, like ivy creeping along a wall. He began to notice her waiting for him outside the orchard, following his steps without speaking, placing small offerings on the work table. A stone she found, a feather, a thread of bright string. She seemed to believe he could keep not only objects alive, but people too. And though the thought unsettled him at first, he found himself softening to it. For her, he became more than a keeper of broken things. He became something else, something larger, though he did not know the word for it. At night, he thought of her presence as he sat at the cracked window. He remembered the way she held the toy to her chest, the way her eyes had steadied when she sat beside him, and he felt the flame in his chest expand in quiet recognition. This too was part of the journey he had been given, not only to mend what was broken, but to protect what was still fragile. The stars blinked above him, and for the first time in many nights he spoke aloud, his voice soft but clear. "I will keep her safe." The window did not answer, but the silence held him as though it had heard. And when he closed his eyes, the image of the child's steady gaze lingered, reminding him that even in the smallest lives, the flame could find new purpose. The child kept returning, her steps light but certain, as if she had claimed the quiet space as much as he had. Days that once stretched into solitude now bent toward her presence. She brought little fragments of the outside world with her. Petals crumbled between her fingers, pockets filled with pebbles, sometimes just stories of things she had seen but could not explain. He listened to each one as though it was sacred, never correcting, never dismissing, only holding her words with the same care he gave to the broken objects spread across his table. In her company, silence no longer meant absence. It became a shared language. As the weeks turned into months, he felt the years within himself more sharply. His body carried a weariness that no flame, no patience, could completely erase. When he rose in the mornings, there were moments when his joints resisted, when his breath felt heavier. Yet when the child appeared, waiting at the door with the small figure pressed close to her chest, he found himself rising anyway. Protecting her gave his weariness direction, and in that direction, strength bloomed again. There were evenings when she fell asleep, curled against the wall of the library, the mended toy in her arms, her breath steady in the hush. He would drape a warm blanket over her and sit nearby, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. In those moments, he felt the passage of time most vividly, not as something to mourn, but as something to honor. He had carried much, endured much, and now, in his age, he was entrusted with her small life. It felt less like a burden than a gift. The village began to notice the child's closeness to him. Some whispered questions, others offered cautious approval, but he paid little mind to either. What mattered was the way she sought him, the way her laughter softened the air that had grown heavy around him. She did not see him as weary, nor as strange. She saw him as steady, as safe. And that recognition was enough to give him a reason to meet each day with the quiet fire still glowing in his chest. The man with tired eyes, who had once been his own guide, came by one afternoon and found them together. The child was chattering about a bird she had seen, her small hands waving as she described its colors. The man listened, then looked at him with an expression that held both pride and relief. "You've become what I could not be," he said softly. And though the boy, no longer a boy now, shook his head in protest, he understood it was not about comparison, it was about continuation. The light passed on, the silence tended, the care carried forward. As night fell, he returned to the cracked window with the child at his side. She pressed her small hand against the glass beside his, her reflection overlapping with his own. Together, they looked at the stars, and for the first time, he realized that his journey was no longer only about carrying silence or mending broken things. It was about giving what he had kept alive to someone who would one day carry it further than he could. The flame in his chest glowed steady, reflected in her wide, unblinking eyes. He whispered into the dark, words he had once struggled to release, but now found no resistance in speaking. "It is yours too." The child did not answer, but she leaned against him, and he knew she had heard. The seasons turned again, and with each one he felt the measure of his years more fully. The flame inside him still glowed, but its warmth was tempered now by the weight of time. Rising in the mornings took longer, his steps carried less speed, his breath thinned more quickly. Yet the child's presence never faltered. She remained close, her hand often slipping into his as they walked the orchard paths, her voice carrying lightness when his own grew heavy. She did not speak of his slowing body, did not name the changes she surely noticed. Instead, she matched her pace to his without comment, as though this, too, was part of the bond between them. The cracked window had become their shared place. Where once it had been his solitary companion, now it reflected two faces, his lined and weathered, hers still bright with the openness of youth. He taught her how to listen to its silence, how to press her palm against the cool glass, and wait for the whisper of wind, how to notice the way stars shifted slightly each night. She absorbed everything, not with questions, but with the same stillness he had once carried alone. Watching her, he realized that what had once been his burden was slowly becoming her inheritance, not the weight of silence, but the gift of hearing what others overlooked. At times, memory caught him unprepared. He would see her laughter and remember another girl, the one who had folded boats beside him, the one who had drifted away with promises of rowing toward her own horizon. The ache of that absence had softened over years, but it never vanished. Now it lived beside the tenderness he felt for the child, a reminder that love did not replace itself but layered one upon the other, shaping him into something more whole. He never spoke of it, but on nights when the stars gleamed sharply, he would tell the child stories of paper boats without naming the companion who had once folded them with him. She listened, wide-eyed, and carried the stories as though they were her own. The man with tired eyes came less often now, his own years pressing down. When he did appear, he and the boy, now a man himself, greying at the temples, shared glances more than words. One evening, as the child dozed against the wall of the library, the man looked at him and said simply, "Windows are for leaving too." The words lingered long after he was gone, echoing as both truth and warning. He understood them, though he did not yet know when they would come to pass. The library of forgotten things grew quieter. He still mended what was left for him, still tended to the fragments, but more and more it was the child who reached for the broken pieces first. Her small hands fumbled, but her determination was steady. He guided her gently, never correcting harshly, never rushing her, and in her clumsy stitches and crooked repairs he saw the beginning of something larger. She was not only learning to mend objects, she was learning to mend the world. One night, as they sat at the cracked window, she turned to him and asked, "Will you always be here?" The question was simple, yet it struck him with a weight that nearly unravelled his silence. He looked at her, at the way her reflection overlapped with his in the glass, and he answered with the only truth he could give. "Not always, but what I carry," he touched his chest lightly, "will stay with you." She pressed her hand over his, small fingers warm against his worn skin, and for the first time he felt no need to add more. The silence between them was enough, filled with stars and memory, with the flame that now burned in both of them. The question the child had asked, "Will you always be here?" echoed quietly in him long after the night had passed. He carried it into his mornings, into the orchard walks that grew slower, into the evenings when his hands trembled slightly as he worked. He knew she had not asked from fear, but from knowing, the way children sometimes glimpse truths more clearly than those older than them. And though he had answered honestly, he felt the weight of her gaze each time she looked at him now, as though she were already preparing herself for the day when silence would take his place. The cracked window, which had been his companion since the beginning, seemed to deepen its role. Its fracture had spread slightly with time, a thin new branch tracing across the glass, and when he pressed his palm to it, he felt not just the cold of the night, but the echo of years layered within it. He began to see more in its reflection, not only himself and the child, but faces he had carried in memory. The caretaker, humming broken lullabies. The man with tired eyes, shaping silence into guidance. The girl who once folded boats beside him, whose laughter still shimmered in the spaces he kept alive. Their reflections hovered faintly behind his own, not as ghosts but as reminders that his life had always been more than solitary waiting. He had carried them with him, and now, through him, they remained. The child noticed how long he lingered at the window. One evening she joined him without speaking, her small hand pressed beside his on the cold glass. They stood together as the stars bloomed overhead, and for a moment the night itself felt like a gathering, a sea of quiet faces watching, patient and endless. He felt their presence not as absence but as continuity, as though he were walking among them even as he stood still. The boy he had once been, listening at the window for whispers, seemed to lean forward too, gazing at the man he had become. The library of forgotten things had grown into something beyond his imagining. It was no longer just a room filled with objects. It was a tide of memory, a place where people came to leave not only what was broken, but what they wished to preserve. Sometimes the child would point to an object and ask who it belonged to. He would answer in fragments, sharing not just the item's story, but the way it had entered his own. She listened, her silence deep and reverent, as though she understood that every broken fragment was also a thread tying them to lives that had come before. He began to sense that this was his role now, not only to mend, but to remember, to be the keeper of stories no longer spoken. And in doing so, he saw how memory itself carried a kind of mercy. It did not erase loss, it did not soften grief, but it wove them into something bearable, a fabric of echoes that reminded him he had not walked alone. That night, as he leaned once more against the cracked window, he whispered into the dark, "I have carried you all." The stars did not flicker any brighter, but he felt their acknowledgement in the stillness that followed. The child, half asleep beside him, stirred faintly, resting her head against his arm. He looked down at her and realized that the faces reflected in the window were not only of the past, they were also of the future. She would carry him just as he had carried others, and in this way nothing would truly be lost. The flame in his chest burned steadily, not fierce but enduring, a light meant to guide him into the shadows he knew were approaching. And though the horizon of his life was nearer now than ever before, he felt no fear, only a quiet awe, the sense that he was part of something larger, something unbroken even by time. The nights had begun to lengthen, or perhaps it was only that he felt them more deeply now. Each hour carried a sharper edge of silence, and within that silence the old whispers returned. They did not arrive suddenly but crept in gradually, like a low tide reclaiming the shore. At first, faint murmurs threaded through the wind against the cracked window, voices he could almost mistake for memory. But then, with each passing dusk, they grew clearer, weaving themselves around him as though the years had folded back to the very beginning, to the boy who once pressed his ear, to the glass waiting for guidance. He did not recoil from them this time. Where once there had been uncertainty and fear, now there was recognition. These were not strangers speaking through the fracture. They were the echoes of all he had carried, the lives that had walked beside his, the fragments he had preserved in the library of forgotten things. Their voices rose like a chorus, soft and unrelenting, reminding him that endings were never singular. They were continuations disguised as silence. The child, sensing something beyond what her eyes could see, often found him seated before the window long after midnight. She would sit close, not asking questions, her presence anchoring him. Sometimes she would fall asleep against his shoulder, and in those moments he felt the line of inheritance stretching clear, from those who had guided him to himself, and now to her. The thought did not weigh on him as burden, but lifted him, as though he were not fading, but flowing forward through her. One evening, when the whispers swelled stronger than ever, he leaned close to the glass and finally spoke aloud. "I am here," he said, his voice steady though his chest trembled. The words were not only for the voices but for himself, for the child beside him, and for the boy he had once been. "I have listened. I have carried. And now I will be carried." The crack across the window caught the starlight then, shimmering, as though the glass itself had turned liquid. For a breath he felt as if the fracture was no longer a wound, but a seam between worlds, between past and present, between himself and all that waited beyond. He pressed his palm against it, and for the first time, instead of cold, he felt warmth radiating through, as though the voices had finally reached him in full. The child stirred awake, her eyes heavy but watchful. She looked at him, then at the window, and though she said nothing, he knew she too felt it, the presence of something vast and unseen holding them both. He placed his hand gently over hers and whispered, "Do you hear it?" She nodded, even if she could not truly understand, because sometimes understanding was not required, only faith. The flame inside him flickered once, then steadied into a quiet glow, no longer a restless fire, but a lantern meant to guide him across the threshold. He knew the time was drawing near, yet instead of fear he felt a strange serenity. He was not stepping into darkness. He was returning to the very beginning, where the whispers had first called to him, now ready at last to answer them fully. The night pressed close, but within it lay not emptiness, only a door waiting to open. He closed his eyes and let the voices surround him, no longer asking what they wanted, but ready to walk with them wherever they led. The air in the room had grown still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The crack on the window glowed faintly, its fractured lines no longer resembling a wound, but a constellation, a map of everything that had been carried forward. His hand remained pressed against it, steady, though his strength was slipping quietly with each beat of his heart. The child's small fingers clutched his, and in that simple contact he felt the final confirmation. What he had preserved would not be lost. It had already crossed over into her. The whispers swelled now, no longer fragments but whole voices, layered and unbroken. They were not calling him away, but welcoming him in, folding him into their current like a river, absorbing a stream. For a moment, he saw their faces, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Those he had lost, those he had never truly known, but whose weight he had carried nonetheless. They smiled, as if to remind him that he had never walked alone, not even in the quietest nights when he thought himself forgotten. The child's breathing trembled beside him, caught between fear and awe. She leaned closer, as if sensing that the moment mattered more than anything she could name. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers, and though his voice was soft, It carried the clarity of truth. "Listen carefully," he whispered, "for they will speak to you too. Not tonight, perhaps, but one day. When the silence comes, you must not turn away." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, her eyes wide and shimmering, as though the weight of what he entrusted to her had already begun to settle. He reached up with his other hand, brushing back her hair with a tenderness that belonged not to endings, but to continuations. Then, as though the act of passing on the flame had loosened the last tie holding him here, he felt the warmth from the crack pulse through him, one final time. His breath grew shallow, his chest rising with difficulty, but there was no struggle. Each exhale seemed to release more than air. It released years, burdens, fears that had once bound him. His last words, carried on the thinnest thread of voice, were not a farewell but a promise. "You are not alone." The silence that followed was not empty but full, dense with presence. The child clung to his hand even as it grew still, tears sliding down her cheeks though she did not sob. She sat quietly, listening, because she remembered what he had told her. And in the stillness, she thought she heard it. The faint echo of voices, patient and enduring, brushing against the edge of her awareness like a tide just beginning to reach her shore. The crack across the glass dimmed, its glow sinking back into darkness, but the room remained warmer than before. She sat there long into the night, her small hand resting over his, feeling the lingering warmth fade, but knowing it had not vanished. It had only moved inward, into her. The world outside was unchanged, yet she knew something irreversible had shifted. The whispers had not ended, they had simply changed their listener. And though she was only a child, she felt the line of inheritance settle into place, stretching back through him and all who came before, now flowing through her toward what would come next. Her hand lingered on his long, after the warmth had faded, as though refusing to accept that stillness had settled, where once there had been breath. The night pressed in from all sides, but she did not move, not even when the shadows in the corners of the room shifted unnaturally, bending as if drawn toward her. The voices he had spoken of had not disappeared with him. They hovered faintly, no longer distant, but circling closer, low murmurs brushing against her ears, carrying fragments of words she could not yet understand. She kept listening, steady and unafraid, because his final whisper had given her strength. Slowly, as though testing her, the murmurs began to shape themselves, falling into a rhythm like waves against a shore. There was no malice in them, but neither was there comfort. They were heavy, layered with memory, demanding attention. Her small fingers curled into the fabric of her sleeve, anchoring herself as she realized what he had meant. The silence was never empty. It was a vessel for all that had been carried forward. The crack on the window, though no longer glowing, remained etched like a scar across the glass, catching the faintest trace of moonlight. She lifted her gaze to it, and for the first time she did not see it as fragile. It was a mark of endurance, proof that something could break and yet hold its shape just as she now must. With hesitant movement, she rose from the floor, her knees trembling under the weight of what had been placed upon her. Her eyes drifted back to his still form. The room felt smaller without the gravity of his presence, yet she sensed he had not gone entirely. A residue of him clung to the air, woven into the very fabric of the space. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently to his hand in quiet promise. She would listen. She would remember. She would not turn away when the voices called. When she finally pulled back, the silence outside had deepened. Even the night insects had quieted, leaving the world unnervingly still. She stepped carefully toward the window, each footfall echoing louder than it should, until she stood before the cracked pane. Her reflection stared back, wide-eyed, streaked with tears, yet steadier than before. Behind that reflection, for just a breath, she thought she saw the faintest outline of figures watching, waiting. She placed her palm against the cold glass, mirroring the gesture he had made earlier. The moment her skin touched the surface, the whispers rose, no longer faint, but vibrant, surging like a tide breaking free. She gasped, her heart hammering, but she did not pull away. The voices wrapped around her, neither cruel nor kind, but insistent, as though recognizing her, binding her into their current. The room swayed with their presence, shadows lengthening unnaturally, and though fear rippled through her, it did not consume her. She understood now this was not an ending, but a beginning. His last words echoed once more in her chest. "You are not alone." And in that moment, as the voices pressed closer, she believed it. Her hand trembled against the cold glass, yet she did not withdraw. The whispers pressed harder, curling around her like unseen fingers, tugging at the threads of her mind, and though the weight of them made her knees buckle, she steadied herself, refusing to collapse. They were louder now, distinct, no longer just fragments, but words that carried meaning. They spoke in a cadence older than memory, and though she could not grasp every syllable, she understood enough. They had been waiting. Her breath came shallow, her chest rising and falling with effort, but she did not let go of the window. Something in the crack shimmered faintly again, a thin glow spreading outward like veins of light across the fractured glass. It pulsed once, then again, sinking with the rhythm of her heartbeat until she could no longer tell if it was her or the silence breathing. Her reflection warped in the glow, her face blurred, then sharpened, and within it she saw traces of him, as though part of him had imprinted on her. The weight of realization settled slowly, heavier than grief. He had not simply left her a memory. He had bound her to something greater, something that would not allow retreat. The voices tightened around her, and for a moment she staggered, the sound almost breaking her resolve. Images flooded into her mind, places she had never seen, shadows moving through endless corridors, faces both familiar and strange. She gasped, gripping the glass so tightly her knuckles whitened, as though it were the only anchor against the tide surging within. Yet, amid the storm of voices and visions, a single thread emerged, steady and clear. It was his voice, faint but distinct, cutting through the noise. "Listen, but do not drown." She closed her eyes, clinging to it, letting the chaotic chorus blur into the background. Slowly, the pressure eased, not vanishing but reshaping, adjusting itself around her as though recognizing her resistance. She inhaled deeply, and the next exhale carried steadiness she had not known moments before. When she opened her eyes, the glow had receded into the crack, though it did not vanish. The whispers quieted to a low hum, resting now instead of consuming. The air felt denser, charged, but she could breathe within it. She drew her hand back from the glass and looked at her palm, half expecting it to burn, but it was only her skin, small, fragile, and yet undeniably changed. Turning toward the room again, her gaze fell on his still form. It struck her then, not as finality, but as transition. His silence was not absence, it was the bridge that had carried her here. Her throat tightened, but she did not cry this time. Instead, she whispered softly into the dim room, a vow shaping itself without hesitation. She would not run from what had begun. And as if in answer, the hum of voices swelled faintly once more, not intrusive, but aligned with her breath, almost as though they were waiting for her to take the next step. The faint hum lingered as she moved away from the glass, no longer pressing in on her, but trailing her like a shadow that refused to detach. Each step she took seemed to echo louder than it should, as though the floorboards themselves had joined the rhythm of her heartbeat. Each room felt both smaller and wider, the air close around her, yet filled with a pull outward, tugging her towards something unseen. She paused, her gaze drifting again toward the stillness of his body, and for a moment she wondered if leaving him behind would sever what fragile link remained. But the whisper that rose within her carried a quiet certainty. It was not separation, it was continuation. Her hand brushed against the table as she steadied herself, fingertips grazing the outline of objects she had touched countless times before. Yet now, even the ordinary seemed altered, alive with the faint shimmer that had bled from the crack in the glass. The voices murmured low, as though testing her willingness to listen further, and she found herself no longer recoiling. Instead, she let the sound thread through her, and with it came a sense of direction. Not clarity, never that, but a pull toward the door, toward the world beyond the room. Her body resisted, weighed down by exhaustion and the unspoken fear that whatever awaited would demand more than she could give. Yet when she closed her eyes, she could still hear his voice woven among the whispers, "Listen, but do not drown." That fragment alone was enough to move her. She drew in a slow breath and let her hand slip from the table. The floor creaked beneath her as she stepped forward, the sound swallowed instantly by the hushed weight that filled the house. She reached the door and hesitated, her hand hovering above the handle. Beyond it lay not just the night, but the shift she had already begun. The voices swelled faintly, waiting, their patience tinged with urgency. For a long moment she stood there, her chest tightening, her pulse rapid against her ribs. She knew the instant she crossed the threshold, there would be no return to what had been. With a final glance back toward him, her silence met his. It was no longer a farewell, it was acknowledgement, an unspoken pact that she would carry what he had left in her. The hum grew steadier, no longer scattered but aligning with her steps, guiding her hand as she closed it around the door handle. The latch gave way with a soft click, and the night air spilled in, cool and sharp against her skin. The world outside looked unchanged, but she could feel it pressing differently, as though watching, waiting for her to emerge. She stepped forward, the whispers folding around her like a mantle, and the door shut softly behind her. The road ahead stretched into shadow, yet within the darkness faint pulses of light flickered, small, distant, but undeniably calling her forward. She did not falter this time. Her breath matched the rhythm of the hum, and though her body trembled, her steps were steady. Each footfall carried her deeper into the waiting silence, where the next turn of fate lay hidden just beyond sight. The night seemed to breathe as she stepped further from the house, the cool air wrapping around her in long, deliberate exhales. Shadows stretched and swayed, not with the wind, but with a rhythm that matched the quiet hum still lodged inside her chest. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the narrow road that bled into darkness, though every instinct urged her to glance back. The weight of what she had left behind pressed at her spine, but she resisted. Looking back would mean hesitation, and hesitation would undo the fragile courage that had begun to take root. Her steps echoed faintly against the cracked pavement, each one blending with the soft chorus of whispers that no longer frightened her. They were not louder, but sharper now, as though speaking in a language she was learning only by sound and not by meaning. She strained to catch the edges of the voices, to separate one from another, but each time she nearly grasped a word, it dissolved like smoke. Still their pull was undeniable, guiding her deeper into the uncertain path ahead. A faint flicker appeared in the distance, small, pale, almost mistaken for a reflection of her own eyes catching the dim light. Yet it pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat marking time against the silence. She felt it before she recognized it, a thrum that threaded into the same rhythm beating beneath her skin. Her pace quickened, despite the unease curling at the edges of her thoughts. The voices hummed more intently, urging, almost coaxing her onward. The road narrowed until the trees pressed closer, their branches interlocking above her like the framework of an old cathedral. The air thickened, carrying with it a scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. She slowed, her breath hitching, as though the very air resisted her intrusion. Yet the flicker grew stronger ahead, widening into a glow that seeped through the dark like a wound of light. Her heart pounded harder, the echo nearly drowning the whispers, and for a fleeting second she feared she had lost the thread. But then, soft, almost imperceptible, she heard it again. "Listen, but do not drown." The memory steadied her. She placed her hand against the rough bark of a tree, grounding herself as her legs threatened to falter. The glow thickened until it painted the air with shifting hues, colors that seemed not of night nor day, but of something in between. Her skin prickled as though every nerve had awakened, aware of an unseen threshold she was about to cross. The world behind her receded into stillness, and the silence ahead carried the weight of something waiting, vast and deliberate. She took a step closer, her shadow swallowed by the strange light, and in that instant the whispers hushed, not vanished, but paused, as though watching with her. Her breath caught, her body trembling under the collision of fear and certainty. Whatever lay within that glow was not just the next step. It was the convergence of everything she had carried, every fragment of silence, every hum threaded into her blood. And as the light swelled, touching her face with its alien warmth, she realized the choice was no longer hers alone. The path had chosen her, and she could not turn away. The glow thickened until it seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in slow, deliberate waves, pulling her toward its center. She hesitated only once, a fleeting thought of retreat pressing against the back of her mind, but the silence behind her was heavier now than the uncertainty ahead. Each step into the light stripped away another layer of the night, the world she had known dissolving as though it had only ever been a shell. When she crossed the invisible boundary, the air shifted sharply, pressing against her skin with a force that felt both foreign and intimate. Her vision blurred before sharpening again, and she found herself in a clearing that had not existed moments ago. The trees arched outward, their shapes distorted, bending unnaturally toward the source of the light. At the center stood something neither object nor figure but a convergence, a form built of fragments, shards of glass, pieces of bone, coils of metal, and pulses of raw luminescence, stitched together as though the world itself had tried to bind secrets into shape. Her chest constricted, the rhythm inside her body matching perfectly with the slow beat radiating from the structure. The whispers, silent for too long, resumed now in a low chant, layered and urgent, each voice overlapping the next until they built into a single, undeniable command: remember. The words struck her deeper than sound should. She staggered, clutching her temples, visions flaring, shattered images of moments she could not place, yet knew belonged to her. A woman's face, half in shadow, a hand outstretched toward hers, a scream muffled by silence, and then the same glow, dimmer but present, waiting all along. Her breath broke into sharp gasps as if her body were being torn between what she had lived and what she had forgotten. The structure pulsed brighter, sensing her faltering resolve, pulling her nearer. She reached out instinctively, though her hand trembled violently. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a shock of warmth surged through her, not burning but flooding, filling her veins with something too vast to contain. The whispers silenced in unison, leaving a void so complete it rang louder than noise. Her knees buckled, but she did not collapse. Instead, she stood suspended in a fragile stillness, her body weightless against the pull of the light. She realized then that the glow was not just outside her, but inside, woven into her pulse, her breath, her very being. It had always been there, waiting for her to face it, to accept it. Her vision dimmed and sharpened again, and for the first time she saw not fragments, but a path, lines stretching outward from the structure, branching into directions that all led deeper into what lay beyond. They were not choices in the usual sense, but inevitabilities waiting for her to walk them. Her lips parted, though she could not form words. The silence pressed closer, demanding not sound, but decision. And in that moment, she understood that stepping forward would not only change the path ahead, it would unearth the truth buried beneath every whisper, every flicker of light, every shadow she had feared. The glow pulsed once more, stronger than before, as if impatient. She steadied herself, the trembling subsiding, her breath aligning with the rhythm that had carried her this far. Then, without allowing hesitation to return, she lifted her foot and stepped toward the path the light revealed.